Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you're joining us from. Thank you so much for taking the time to join the Forest Plus, the 1T.org US chapters webinar for this month, featuring, I think, two of the really critical stakeholder groups in our ongoing growing coalition of companies, governments, and NGOs who care about trees and forests. That is companies and youth leaders. And we're really excited today to have one of our favorite youth leaders in the US, Jerome Foster II, who's an ambassador for American Forests on a number of things, has spoken widely and on really interesting topics regarding nature and other things. And of course, our friend Tim Christophersen, who is the VP of Climate Action for Salesforce and a longtime thought leader in this space and guiding advisor to the 1T.org US movement. So we're looking forward to this conversation today, featuring a really cool new book that I've been reading over the weekend, and you probably can't see it because my blur is on, but this is Generation Restoration: How to Fix Our Relationship Crisis with Mother Nature, that Tim has been writing over the last couple of years. And it's really fun to see some of the case studies and familiar with some of the people in this book. But it's kind of, for this moment, been really powerful for me to have this sort of tactical guide when you're feeling frustrated by things, you're feeling frustrated by geopolitics, you're feeling frustrated by things, having this really cool, tangible guide to offer that hope and inspiration that I think we're all really searching for right now. So this is going to be a great conversation and a lot of really rich insights. This is full contact. We want you to participate, so please feel free to put questions in the chat for Tim, for Jerome, and let us know kind of what are the topics that are giving you hope, what are giving you angst, and how are we going to collectively as a movement continue to platform trees and forests as such a critical solution. So thanks again for all of you for joining us. And with that, I want to turn it over to Jerome. Jerome, I'll leave it to you.
Yes, I want to thank everyone for joining this conversation we're having with Tim for Generation Restoration. I think it's really exciting to have like a conversation about this because like young people have been looking to companies and companies have been looking to young people for that sense of knowledge, that sense of excitement, and that sense of momentum that's happening right now. And I just want to hear more from you. I know you're going to go into a brief excerpt from the book, but just wanted to preface it by saying the amount of movement, receptiveness that your Salesforce work has been, and even the years you've done prior to that. I know before 2022, you worked in the public sector in the UN and led a lot of initiatives like the 1 trillion trees initiative, and now are working towards a goal of, I think, around 100 million trees to be planted by 2030. And it's really that kind of momentum we see in the book. I first started reading it this past weekend, and it was opened by this sense of kind of diagnostic about where the world is right now. But by the end of it, you kind of started seeing like that sense of hope and action-oriented guide seep through. And I feel like that was really exciting to see. So I'd love to hear from you, like what takeaways and kind of brief passage you've provided for us here today.
Thank you very much, Jerome, and it's nice to see you again. And thanks, Kevin, also for the nice intro. So let me just show the book again because my background blur isn't on, so you can see the Generation Restoration with a foreword by Jane Goodall, who, as you know, passed away a couple of weeks ago. And we're very grateful to Jane for having provided the foreword to the book, which, as you say, Jerome, it takes stock of the world, but then leads into a message of hope, as always with Jane. She was always this very hopeful, what can we do about it kind of presenter. And that's also the brief passage I want to read from the book is about this link between hope and optimism. But before I do that, just to say that Generation Restoration is not only the title of the book, it's also the hashtag of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration that we're in right now, as you know, and that we're sort of halfway. And when I worked at UNEP, I had the privilege to set up that UN Decade with a small team and FAO and UNEP. And we were brainstorming in 2019, how could we create a UN umbrella that would not be sort of 30,000 feet above everybody's head, but be tangible and reachable, where anybody could dock on and take action on behalf of the UN. So this is the way we structured the decade at that time was in a sort of new power movement, very much how decisions are made in the digital age. And therefore, the hashtag really allows anybody who has a restoration project, who does something for ecosystem restoration, to on Instagram or LinkedIn or X or wherever, to share that, find other people, upload it on platforms like Restore, build that sense of a broad movement and community that I think we feel we all are part of. And the Trillion Trees movement, 1T.org, is the private sector arm of that. So that, as Kevin said, there are hundreds of companies, and you said, Jerome, that companies, you look to youth and youth look to companies. I think that's a very good way of framing it. And we're, of course, all in this together. That's why generation restoration is not about just millennials or Gen A or Gen Z or Generation X like myself. It's about all of us. We're all in this together. So let me just read a very brief passage from the book. Taking action is the most effective way to maintain hope and optimism. Action, hope, and optimism fuel and reinforce each other. However, there are two kinds of optimism, according to economist Paul Romer. He explains complacent optimism is the feeling of a child waiting for presents. It depends on external good news. That is not the kind of optimism we need right now. Even when good news is hard to come by, we can remain optimistic as a matter of choice. The kind of optimism we need is called conditional optimism. The feeling of a child who is thinking about building a treehouse. If I get some wood and nails and persuade some other kids to help do the work, we can end up with something really cool. We all need to be conditional optimists now. Let us strive to cultivate this mindset and remind ourselves daily that every thought and word is a form of energy that makes a difference in the world. So let's all be conditional optimists. Thanks for having me on the program today, which is live streamed, as I understand. So that's the first.
Yeah, I mean, that's really brilliant. I've seen so many conversations that have been around climate, and it's about that sense of optimism. And as you said, like that shift of conditional versus just like blind hope that we feel when we look at the world, and not having that sense of complacency attached to it. I feel it's really powerful. And I want to get deeper into the reason why you gave this book, because I know you're coming from the tech sector, and it's like, what does a technology guy who's leading this space have to do with writing a book about nature? And I want to understand, like, what got you to want to sit down and put these words to paper and put this message out into the world?
Yeah, why does a tech guy write a book about nature? I'm actually a nature guy who entered the tech industry more. I studied forestry and always been very close to forests in my heart. And when I joined Salesforce 3.5 years ago, I had been in the public service for almost 20 years. I'd been 15 years with the UN Environment Program. Before that, I was 5 years with the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And I've always worked on this interface between nature and climate change. So what can nature do for us? What can nature do to mitigate climate change, help us adapt? But also, what is the climate doing to nature? Because it's obviously a two-way street. And then as I worked on this, and now been working on this for 25 years, the same topic from national government, the European Commission, I was in with ICN, then with the UN, and now with the private sector. It's almost like taking a walk around a big mountain and you see it from different angles. It gives you a more holistic picture of what it is that we need to do, but also that the way to the top is the same for everybody else. We want a better future. We want a healthier future, a greener future, a cleaner future. We want to prosper. And for that, we have to collaborate. So when working on this topic, I started to ask myself more and more fundamental questions, because with the superficial questions, like, why is the renewable energy transition not going fast enough? With questions like that, we don't get far enough at the moment. So I believe we have to ask ourselves bigger questions, because with the small questions, we're not solving the big issues. That's why I wrote the book. So in the book, I'm going into questions of where does our belief that that nature is just a commodity, where does it actually come from? Because it is not true, and it's not healthy, and it's not good for nature, and ultimately it's not good for us. The view that nature is a commodity leads to what the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres calls a suicidal war with nature. We always take. And if you've ever been in a relationship where somebody only ever takes, they never give, that's an abusive relationship. It's a toxic relationship, and that has to end at some point, one way or the other. So that's the relationship we're in with nature right now. We take. It's an extractive world economy. We have an extractive mindset. We have the mindset that nature is a commodity. It's just a warehouse that's also always full. There's always lots of it, right? So we can just take. It'll come from somewhere. But we are now at the end of that philosophical autopilot. So in the book, I explore, where did that worldview come from? Why are so many of us linked to this worldview that this is the only way we can run our economy or live on this planet? So yeah, that's why I wrote the book. I wanted to ask some bigger questions for big problems which we can't seem to solve with the same thinking that we've used in the past decades.
I mean, exactly. It's that sense of doing the same thing 1,000 times and you just get to the same result, and that equals a sense of stagnation. But no, I think it's really clever, like thinking about like the fact that, as you said, you circle the mountain, you see it from all different perspectives. I think a lot of people just kind of look at the environmental crisis as like one problem here, one problem there, and it's so siloed from what we see as the long-term impact that we're seeing. And I know you talked in the book like this shifting baseline syndrome as one aspect of that, of how like fishermen went out in the 1970s and they got large fish over like 6 pounds that they would take pictures with, and they basically were so excited by it. And then now in 2000, I think it was a few decades later, they had fish that were like less than 1 feet that were like caught, and they had that same sense of excitement, but they didn't have the historical context of the nature loss and the ecosystem loss that was happening. I think as a young person as well, I was coming to this movement and seeing that 1 pound fish and being like, oh, that's the excitement we have. We have to maintain and get back to that level so we don't keep getting smaller and smaller fish. But really, our true goal should be actually thinking about how do we get back to the nature of the 1970s, 1960s, and see an ecosystem that feels flourishing beyond even our own comprehension of what could be possible. And I wanted you to talk a bit more about that. Like, how do you see like the longer time horizon of what is possible over this next decade beyond 2030 of the ecosystem restoration? How do we think about a new economy or a new society that doesn't just, as you said, take and take, but figures out a way to have reciprocity with it?
So there's a saying that we sometimes overestimate what we can achieve in 1 year, but we also underestimate how much we can achieve in 1 decade. So having this United Nations decade on ecosystem restoration is very important because we can start to plan in a somewhat longer time frame. In the book, I expand that time horizon a little bit because I argue that we need a century of ecology to reset this balance and learn basic ecological literacy for planet Earth, which interestingly has been leading motto of the Chinese-led biodiversity conference, and having this ecological citizenship is not a new idea, but I think it's a very important idea, because if you look at the roots of the world of the word ecology, it comes from ancient Greek. Oikos is our common home, our common household. And the ecology is the knowledge of our common home. That's what ecology means. Economy has the same root. The economy is the management of our common home. So what we're doing right now is we're managing this household, planet Earth, without the knowledge of how it really works. And that leads to all these problems of resource depletion, nosedive in species populations. Since the 1970s, we've lost 73% of all wildlife populations in my lifetime. If you would weigh all the mammals on planet Earth, 4% of the mammals would be wildlife. The rest are humans and livestock. So we live at the moment in what you could call a 10% world compared to the riches and the natural abundance and diversity that we used to have. What that means for this generation that is alive today. Again, I'm not only talking about millennials. I always think it's unfair when people say, "Oh yeah, the young people, you're so smart, you're gonna fix this," because this is not for you to fix, right? The youth is not the generation in power, not the generation with resources.
Yeah.
Everybody has to fix this. So when we look at the longer timeframes of human generations, I think what is important is to get past this shifting baseline syndrome that you described, because we can sometimes forget how much richer we were, how much more abundance and diversity there was on planet Earth. But nature doesn't forget. Nature still knows how much diversity and abundance there should be. And I think we cannot go back. There's no going back. But we can go forward into a future where humans are thoughtful, deliberate, and well-educated ecosystem engineers, where we play our role as a species, probably Earth's most powerful ecosystem engineer by far. Because normally you talk about ecosystem engineers and you mean beavers or wolves or elephants or species that are shaping an entire landscape so that thousands of other species find habitat there and can live there. We are that too. We can be guardians and creators of entire landscapes full of abundance and diversity and beauty. And we can do that again. We just need the imagination. I think that's where it starts. And for the imagination, it's sometimes useful to just look back a few decades and see how much more diversity and abundance we had.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. Like there's so much of that compassion and imagination that's lacking from our way of thinking. And I wanted to think about as well, like you talked about how like so much of this urgency around getting back to what was leads us to sometimes just like think about like, say example, like the number of trees we want to plant, without thinking about how holistically we can approach this to support economies, support impacted communities, to support just the way in which society functions as not just a tree being here and that provides services for the community, but the community should benefit and build out entire systems around that. And I know the work you're doing in Salesforce is about that example. Like you talked about in Madagascar, where you had a big goal of planting like mangrove trees and wanting to basically remake this community, but you saw that the local economy incentivized the creation of burning down trees and what they're valuable for the wood that they had, not the societal benefits they provided. And I want to think more about like how does that kind of that trade-off of like a perfection versus progress and figuring out what that looks like, and how have you seen like that holistic element come into play? Because so much of my work as a young person has been like just getting people motivated to take action, any action they can, but also thinks about like not everyone has to play that one role like you're talking about an ecosystem. Everyone takes up different parts of it. And in communities that oftentimes don't even know about the climate crisis, don't even know what it means, like how has that changed the way in which you come about these types of conversations?
So we have amazing technology at our fingertips in the time that we live in, right? We can connect with each other in real time around the world. We have now AI to help us become ecologists in record time. We can see from satellite imagery when we lost these mangrove trees in Madagascar, which I'll talk about in a minute, the example that you mentioned. We had to check on that project. We had very high resolution satellite imagery that allowed us to see every single tree and even every single tree seedling and small trees. So we have all this technology that is amazing. What we don't have, though, is a technology that allows basically what I would call landscape relationship management. You know, how does everybody in the landscape come together, see what their role is, decide on a joint vision, what people want to do, what that landscape should look like, ensure that there's enough jobs and livelihoods so people also have a long-term sustained commitment to that restored landscape. And that's exactly what we didn't have in Madagascar. So this was an early project that Salesforce founded at a time when we had made a commitment to conserve or plant 100 million trees, which is a lot, and there was little time to do it. So at some point, it was about planting as many trees as fast as possible. And that is not a good idea usually, because you want to be sure that the restoration you do is actually sustainable, that it can take root, that also you use nature's power for restoration wisely, in a sense that nature is usually the most effective and cheapest way to restore and replant trees. Trees don't need to be planted mostly. They often can just replant themselves once you remove the drivers of deforestation. But in this project in Madagascar, what hadn't happened at the beginning was a holistic assessment of what were actually the drivers of degradation, what were the livelihood situations in the local community. So we went out there and we redid the whole assessment. And then instead of just planting as many tree seedlings as possible, what we now do in all our partnerships and all our projects, we have 30 projects around 15 countries worldwide, is to ensure that there's always a holistic assessment of what is this landscape, what kind of ecosystem services does it provide, where does it benefit people, how can these people participate in the restoration, how can they maybe even pay for some of the restoration if it's a company and they benefit from water from a forested mountain watershed, how can you channel some of that money back into conservation and restoration. So that holistic mapping, but also the holistic vision of what is actually the landscape that we want, is really, really important for successful projects. And that's what we see more and more with the UN World Restoration projects, the flagship projects, as they're called, where we have these very, very large landscapes where you have thousands, sometimes millions of people who embark on a common journey and towards a common vision of restoring these landscapes at a massive scale. So I'm quite hopeful that this lesson has now been learned. I mean, we all got the memo that it's not just about planting trees. It's about holistic landscape restoration. And I think all the companies that are involved in the Trillion Trees initiative also clearly heard that message loud and clear and have shifted a lot of their funding. On the downside, though, this has scared away many companies because it's so hard and complex. And some companies got bad press out of sort of doing something which they thought was the right thing. And now they're hanging back because it is a complex space to engage in. So we would like to see more companies be courageous enough to lean in and say, we need forests. We need healthy forest ecosystems for so many things. So we lean in, we try to restore them together with knowledgeable partners like American Forests, which we work a lot with, as you know. So, but there are others as well, also in other parts of the world. But American Forest is one of those partners that we have relied on a lot.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly powerful. Like seeing so many conversations around like reforestation really lean into that sense of ambition. Like if it doesn't work out sometimes, it's like at least we're on that journey of moving things forward, and like we're like a vanguard in that space. Like Salesforce has been an ally to so many young people and providing spaces for us to organize and like to just show up. And even just for our 150th last month in September, it was exciting to see that sort of partnership show up in so many ways. And I think I want to think about as well, like how do you see like the next couple of years in forestry? Because I know you like I was reading about your story like in preparation for this, and I felt something so in common of like you growing up in like a rural area and like your grandfather was a forester and like spending time in nature. And most of my childhood is exactly the same. Like I grew up in Washington D.C. and spent almost all my time in forests. And like for you, it's just getting out in nature, like feeling that sense of what can I do to be a part of this ecosystem. And I wanted you to talk a bit more about that. Like what is your personal journey and how has that influenced like your vision of what the next couple of years can look like?
Yeah, there was actually not so much for me to do when I was a kid other than spend time in nature. So it was
Yeah.
not really a choice at that time, but I spent a lot of time hiking and fishing and camping and going on long walks with my grandfather, and who was a forest ranger. And that love and affinity I felt for nature has never left me, but it has changed over time, interestingly, because as a kid, I had a very different understanding, almost an intuitive understanding of the power and the vitality of ecosystems. I could go into a forest and I could feel how healthy that forest was. If it was, if it had been suffering from acid rain, there were forests we went to, monoculture Norway spruce plantations, which were the sort of default bread and butter tree of the German forest industry at that time. but they had soils that were too acidic, and that many of them then toppled over a few years actually after I visited them in a winter storm in 1999, and also storms in the 1980s. So when you feel an ecosystem is not doing well because it lacks the diversity it needs, it lacks the connectivity between species and the soil biodiversity it needs, I could basically sense that as a child, which I've never been able to explain. But when I studied forestry, of course, you learn about all these things. You learn about what is the fungal network that connects the mycorrhiza, that connects the roots, that connects the trees. How do species collaborate in a forest ecosystem to make it more than the sum of its trees? So I relearned all of that, but I also think there's an intuitive connection that humans have with ecosystems. We can tune in to what nature is telling us, what nature needs, what nature provides us. And I believe that is what indigenous peoples speak about when they speak about being related to nature, because nature is not a balance sheet it's not a line on our corporate balance sheet. Nature is more than that. Nature is our balance, and nature is our home. Nature is our family. And when you see nature from that perspective, which I call for in the book, of course, who wouldn't invest in their family or in their home? It becomes a completely different discussion why you should give back to nature than the discussion of what is the business case, which is also, for 25 years, I've told companies and governments what the business case is for investing in nature. And there's lots of good economic reasons to invest, but there's so much more powerful reasons to invest in nature and rebuild that relationship. And again, that's what the book is about. It has a whole chapter on natural capital and why we need about $1 trillion a year reinvested back into our most critical infrastructure, nature. But the book also goes beyond that. What is our relationship with nature that we need to rebuild? So I think in the next 5 years, sorry to long answer to your very good question, what happens in the next 5 years?
No, I love it. Keep going.
The big shift I've seen in the past 2 or 3 years, I would say, is that when I was your age, this used to be almost exclusively guided by grants. Philanthropies gave grants for nature. Public sector spent some monies on nature, for privates, for protected areas. What I've seen in the last 3 years in particular is this emergence of a very large, potentially very large, right now it's still rather small, but a potentially very large nature conservation and restoration industry. Nature is now an asset class, which means financial institutions and long-term investors like pension funds have the tools and the metrics to be able to completely accurately assess what are the risks here, what are the opportunities for investments in nature, how can I mitigate the risks for long-term investments. Just like in real estate or infrastructure or other long-term investments that pension funds invest in, we can now do that with nature, even beyond traditional plantation forestry. You can do it with nature restoration, you can do it with the carbon markets, with nature restoration for water benefits. And if you look at the last 4 years, private sector finance for nature has gone up 11-fold to about $100 billion per year. Just in the last 12 months, I've spoken with almost 10 new nature-based solution investment funds in the 500 million, $1 billion range. These are now all looking for good projects. They're all going to be looking for great people to help them think through how this works. They're going to be looking for ecosystem engineers, but you can't study ecosystem engineering in a lot of places yet. So I think that's one of the new study lines that we will have to see. How do you become an ecosystem engineer? Just like there are civil engineers and there are mechanical engineers. We need a few more ecosystem engineers. And I think that restoration industry will grow to $1 trillion global business within the next, probably not 5 years, but in the next decade, hopefully. Because it's at the end of the day, it's simple physics. We need that kind of infrastructure that nature can provide for everything, for all our food, for all our water, for all our housing. So once that bank account runs dry and we run out of natural capital, we have to reinvest. And that means rebuilding nature at planetary scale. And for that, you need a workforce who does that, and you need investors who invest in that. So this is the big shift I see now in halfway through the UN decade.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible progress we've been seeing so far. Now in 2025, we have 60 million trees being planted. That's well past the 50% mark that we're hoping for by 2030. And it's like 30 projects, 15 countries. It's like that's kind of the momentum we want to see, and that economy is kind of building towards that. And I want to think more about like the final question before we go into Q&A is like, what has been your like most favorite examples of hope you've seen around the world, and what keeps you going day to day around that sense of optimism, and as you said, conditional optimism?
Well, I start with the smallest project that gives me hope, which is our farm here. We bought a farm 5 years ago, and we're restoring it through agroforestry and a permaculture with rotational sheep grazing. And just to see how quickly nature bounces back if given a chance, and how quickly the soil biodiversity comes back, how quickly we planted about 30,000 trees in one of the fields that used to be crop monoculture field with not a lot of soil biodiversity. And to see how quickly that forest sort of reestablishes biodiversity and ecosystem services that go beyond what that field could do before is really, really encouraging. So that's the smallest project I'm involved in. And then the biggest project I'm involved in is there's a chapter in the book on indigenous wisdom and indigenous knowledge, and it's called Acción Andina. And you're familiar with that project. I think it's one of the UN World Restoration flagships. Acción Andina aims to restore the entire forest watershed of the high Andes. So these are places 13,000 feet and above, 12,000, 13,000 feet, where there used to be cloud forests that captured a lot of moisture and filtered and stored it for all of Latin America. But there's only about 10% of that forest left. And with the glaciers retreating, those forests are now very important for water security. So Acción Andina is run by an NGO called Global Forest Generation and a Latin America consortium called ECOWAS. And they've mobilized 40,000 people, or I believe more now, just in the past 6 years. They've now planted 15 million trees. They work in 400 locations from Venezuela to Patagonia. The vision is to restore all these high Andes forest watersheds. And it builds on an indigenous principle of reciprocity with nature, reciprocity with that ecosystem. Because those people, they don't lead very easy lives, because living up there under harsh conditions, often very resource constrained, they are not the typical people who just spend their weekend, volunteering for something because they have the time or the money. They do it because they need to give back to the mountain, because the mountain takes care of them. The mountain provides water, provides the food that they need, and they give back to nature. They give back to the community. The community takes care of each other, and that includes the ecosystem. So that, I think, reciprocity exists in more places than the Andes. I think you could go around the world and find that hidden and often buried under modern forms of agriculture or our way of treating the land. But I think that still exists in a lot of places, that form of reciprocity with nature.
No, it's incredible. Like I was just in a conversation with Dalai Lama and her his aunt, not his aunt, his nephew, recently a few days ago, and she was talking about like how the world feels like it's in a sense of despair, but really what's happening is like we're like a tree that's growing, and like all of a sudden the tree decides like we've grown enough, we've done a lot of growing, and now it's time for development, to make sure every tree and every branch and every root has equal access. And that sense of hope comes from that sense of thinking about this is the transition towards development, like you saw in the Andes and in the United States and in Europe, that like there's a sense of optimism that's coming from this progress that we're seeing. So I want to turn to Q&A if we can. And I would love to take a few from the audience. Let's see. Let's see. How do I see these questions that are coming up? I think I see.
Now, Jerome, looks like there's a good one from Melissa, but I thought before we do that one, maybe as you transfer that out, just ask Tim maybe about sort of the short term, looking forward, looking from you and the Climate Week New York, Climate Week other places, how you're sensing sort of sense of momentum leading up to COP30 here this coming up this next month in Belém, and how forests and nature I think are hopefully playing a central role in a lot of the discussions, and just some of your all big picture thoughts around COP30 and how this work is going to translate.
Yeah, COP30 is happening next month and starts in about 2 weeks in the middle of the Amazon in Belém in Brazil. And the meeting is very important. It's maybe one of the most important COPs we've had in a while because we face political headwinds in some regions around the world against climate action. At the same time, the Amazon is probably the planetary climate tipping point that is closest to tipping. If it flips from a moist tropical forest into what is called a woodland savanna with more frequent fires, it will shift from a carbon sink to a carbon source. That could trigger other global climate tipping points. So we cannot afford to lose the Amazon. And that's why I'm very hopeful to see there's so many activities that turn what is called the arc of deforestation along the Amazon into the arc of restoration. There's a big move by the state governments of the Amazonian states and by the Brazilian federal government to give out concessions for ecosystem restoration. Salesforce has joined with Meta, Microsoft, and Google to form the Symbiosis Coalition. And we have, through that coalition, committed to take off these projects up to 20 million tons of high quality nature-based removals. So these are ecosystem restoration carbon credits. And we've just gone through the first request for proposals and will announce in Brazil what the first projects are that will benefit from that coalition. There are large-scale proposals by the Brazilian government to establish what is called the Tropical Forest Forever Facility, or TFFF. You've probably followed that closely. Very novel idea to raise money on the global capital markets, and then from the proceeds, a small portion would go into paying tropical forest countries to achieve and then maintain a low deforestation rate. So that's really important to have that success out of COP30. So we all should support, if we can, the Brazilian government and that ambition, which it is a very ambitious, very innovative idea. So I'm hopeful that people are rising to the occasion, that we need to do more. It's of course also more difficult than it was in a while, but in my 25 years, I can never remember this work being easy, where everybody said, "Oh yeah, that's what we should do." It's always been a struggle, and it probably continue to be. I just have the feeling there's a lot more people who actually want to see action on nature investments, on forest restoration, on healthy forest ecosystems, on nature as part of the climate solutions. Even, I think, in the United States, it's one of those nonpartisan issues where hopefully everybody can still agree that we need forests. Everybody can still agree we need nature. We want clean water. We want clean air. So if we can do something for this together with governments, civil society, and companies, I think we'll see that play out in Brazil.
Amazing. And Kevin, if you're able to see any of the questions in the chat, I'd love to pull up some of those.
Sure thing. I've got one from Melissa, who's talked a little bit about how some of the challenges for practitioners on the ground. This sort of decades of work with very little funding, very little support. And talking about how she's providing wellness checks for her colleagues on the ground right now. But essentially, the question that I think she's driving towards is, the investment isn't coming nearly fast enough, and the impacts are awful. What is your advice to those in the space now, and what, in your experience, is the best first move to overcoming these really challenging circumstances for folks on the ground?
Well, the first move is to realize that you're not alone and to make sure you're connected, not only for emotional support, but obviously also for political influence, for being a voice to be reckoned with in these discussions, because a lot of times there is still budget available from government support programs. There's more and more budget available from the voluntary carbon market, even though that is very difficult to enter. As you probably know, there's a lot of complexity in the VCM. So I would definitely say the first move is to connect with more people and use technology there as an ally. This is where AI can really help us, and hopefully in the near future, tools like Perspective AI or Discourse AI can help us make sure we get a agreement in a community, in a constituency, on a project of what people actually want to see happen in their community. And you will often see that that is actually closer to what you want to achieve than you perhaps think, because at the end of the day, we will all benefit from more restored nature. There'll be more jobs, more clean water, more timber. There'll be more wildlife. There'll be more tourists coming to your area. There'll be better opportunities for your local community to advance. There'll be more people moving into your town or city because it has better access to nature. So who can actually be against that? I don't think if you put it in the right context and form a coalition with the community on the ground, this is an unstoppable force over time. But just like in nature, you need patience. Nature is infinitely patient, which is probably the thing that I still need to learn most from nature, because I'm not a very patient person normally. But it's one thing that I think we can all learn. This is a long game that we can all observe from nature. We need a long haul. This is a marathon and not a sprint.
Here, here. Well, question from one of our listeners from Switzerland, asking about deforestation in Europe in general, and I'll expand it a little bit to talk a little bit about some of the regulatory pieces. But what needs to happen in Europe, and then I know there's been a lot of action in Brussels around the deforestation free supply chains and some other policy levers that would have impact not only in Europe but around the world. Talk a little bit about Europe's role.
Yeah, interestingly, when you look at Europe, Europe's actually gaining about 1 million hectares per year of forest area, mostly because of land abandonment in rural areas where agriculture is no longer feasible and forests are regrowing. So on the quantity side, forests are doing well in Europe. On the quality side, not so much, because we're still seeing old growth, very diverse forests being replaced with plantations, which of course is qualitatively a huge difference between what ecosystem services those forests can provide. So I think the other big role that Europe can play is as a global leader on the EU nature restoration law. The EU has committed, it was a political cliffhanger last year, but the law still stands, to restore 30% of its degraded areas. And that, coming back to my earlier point, will trigger a restoration industry as a profession, hopefully as a job engine in rural areas. And then, of course, the third role that Europe can play is as a importer of forest risk commodities, especially soy, palm oil, beef, leather, but also timber. And there, the EU deforestation regulation has had a difficult start because the tech platform didn't work, and then there were a lot of questions about how companies should implement it. There's still hope that that regulation will be useful if it is fixed and adjusted to ensure that imports into the EU do not further contribute to deforestation. And that is, of course, possible. As we know, you can have palm oil that is sustainably sourced. You can have agroforestry that is even restoring degraded areas and produces beef and other export commodities. So we have we have that opportunity in Europe, and obviously now it's also important that Europe plays that leadership role at a global stage, including in places like COP30.
And we have one more question from the chat as well. This says, what advice do you have for nonprofits trying to fundraise from corporate sectors? What advice do you have for corporate employees trying to convince the executives that nature restoration should be a part of their business plan?
So if you go to the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures website, the TNFD, you will see that there's now several hundred companies that have made nature part of their balance sheets, that have run the TNFD assessment, have launched nature strategies like Salesforce has in 2003, and we're updating that in next month with a water program that also looks specifically at restoring forest watersheds. There are a lot of companies that want to do the right thing. There's still, I think, a lack of capacity in the companies what to do. But when I look back at who we work with in Salesforce and what also other big companies do, my advice would be try to understand exactly what the business's needs are in terms of what visibility do they want, what outcomes do they want, what ecosystem services do they want, which will differ whether you're Coca-Cola or HP or Salesforce or Volkswagen. You have to really know the company and ensure you understand completely and exactly where, why, and how they want to invest before you engage. And again, get AI to help you with that. It's probably easier than ever to get a very clear profile of what the company's investment interests are in nature restoration, and then follow if they have RFPs or if they have trusted partners through which you can maybe log a project. So use technology.
Exactly. Use technology. I mean, it's such a force multiplier of all the work that we do. It's been incredible seeing just transition over the past couple of years. I have one more question as well. It says, how do we work to elevate our approaches to large-scale restoration, such as assisted natural regeneration? What are some of the biggest obstacles or challenges that you need to overcome going beyond tree planting?
So we see that there are landscapes in the world where this works really well, especially in the tropics. And what you have to do then is you focus on removing the drivers of deforestation or degradation. That's often easier said than done because it is, of course, the overgrazing and the interests of the local livestock owners that has driven deforestation, or it is the conversion to agriculture, or maybe many other factors. When you remove that, in a lot of places, nature will bounce back quickly and you can run assisted natural regeneration. However, that does not work, as you know, many of you on the call will know, in areas where natural regeneration would take too long. It would take centuries because there's too few remnant native trees left. It would take too long because the soil is now too baked after massive fire events like we've seen with the recent mega fires, for example, where you need human intervention. So this word assisted, I think, is key because we are, coming back to my earlier point, that we are ecosystem engineers and we should play that role with deliberation and with knowledge and with skill. And then we can help nature, we can work with nature, but we shouldn't just sort of let nature run its course if we want that landscape to be a landscape where humans and nature live in harmony, because then it's in our interest to ensure restoration happens pretty fast, because the faster it happens, the better and sooner we can benefit from the ecosystem services, but also that we have a say in what the landscape looks like and what it should provide, what kind of balance should there be between different forms of use. So make sure we assist nature in the right way. And it's a very case-by-case decision. You know, if I would summarize 6 years of studying forestry into one sentence, it depends. You know, it depends on the local context and on the project and on where you are and on the tree species and on the stakeholders. So giving forest restoration advice on a global call for all regions is a hard task.
Well, no, I think that's a good message to close with. Do you have anything else to say to the audience that we're here today around what the book is, like how they can show up at it, where they can pick it up? I know it's in a few physical locations as well, so let people know how they can get a hold of Generation Restoration.
Definitely Barnes and Noble, for example, who just opened a whole range of new stores across the US. So reading actually seems to be on the rise, which is interesting in the age of AI. People actually still read physical books, which I love. I listen to most of my books as audiobooks. There's no audiobook version yet, that's coming, but there's an ebook, it's on Kindle, it's on Amazon, it's on all the different online platforms. You can go to timchristophersen.com, you see all the order information. And yeah, I would love to hear from people, especially on LinkedIn, but also on Instagram, where I'm, I think, maybe a tenth of 1% of your follower size, Jerome. But I've started an Instagram account. I'd love to hear from people what they think of the book and to engage in a dialogue. And please use the hashtag, use Generation Restoration to also signal across the political spectrum, across the world, that people are interested in restoring nature at planetary scale, because it's the most important task for this generation if we want to leave this planet in a well-functioning and nice environment to live in that is good for people and for nature.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. And I know personally, I read a lot of books and audiobooks like yourself, so I look forward to that. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us today. And everyone who is here, let's keep on going. Let's see Generation Restoration just like continue for this next decade until 2030 and beyond. So use the hashtag, see the book on his website below, attached in the chat, and excited to see you all in the future.
Here, here. And then on behalf of Forest Plus and our community here in the United States, thank you to Tim and thank you to Jerome. Tim, your leadership has been phenomenal over these years. So we look forward to working hand in hand with you to get hashtag Generation Restoration, keep it going for these next 5 years. So thank you all for being with us, and we're excited. We've got future webinars coming up next month in December. They're going to be digging in really about the details about some non-traditional partners in restoration from the utility sector, and then a really top-down approach from our friends at the World Economic Forum and McKinsey about some of the really exciting drivers of investment in restoration. So thank you, Tim. We appreciate your leadership on this and look forward to staying in touch with you all over the coming months. Have a great day.
Thanks, Jerome. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, everybody.
Oh, thank you, Tim.